So I will start the recording, and please, Professor, the floor is yours, and I can share the screen.
Buongiorno, grazie. My talent is not working on that. Sorry, I have been practicing fine, but not enough. So, first question. Can I take my mask off?
Yes.
Yes, please.
So, thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to share some insights of a recent paper that I wrote jointly with Professor Flávio Menezes. Professor Flávio Menezes is from the Queensland University Department of Economics. He has worked extensively with auctions, mechanism design, network industries, and we had started working together roughly 20 years ago. And we have tried in several moments to take stock of recent developments in network industries in Brazil. So there was a first reform that happened in 2003. And we wrote a first paper on that. 10 years later, we assessed. And now, 15 years later, we have worked also assessing a recent reform that has been designed to adapt this industry and its workings to the energy transition that is also taking place there. I think this work is illustrative of an experience of a power system that was established along the lines of a very large hydro dominant basis, and so quite renewable, extensively renewable. It managed to expand, preserving this characteristic, and it has been challenged by climate uncertainty. And we dare say it has not exactly succeeded in adapting to the climate uncertainty we are experiencing. So in this presentation, how much time do I have?
Yeah, 30 minutes.
Okay, so the idea is to have
Let's see.
let us see if I press the wrong button.
No, I don't think so.
In the meantime, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of sharing this work.
Okay.
I think it's here, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's
Okay. My USB is there. Yes.
I will be talking while she adjusts the file. So the plan here is to combine this work with a few elements that relate to the climate agenda. Okay, it's here. Okay. So keep in mind that I'm not a climate person, but I think it's very important that we try to adjust to present information related to the background of, okay, let's see if it's going to work.
Watch out. No, I don't know if this problem if we put it in.
Okay.
So maybe it's better. Yes, exactly.
Okay. So the idea is to start with some information on the country and the power system background, starting by some, I called it Climate 101, okay, because this is not my area of expertise, but this is interesting. These are the climate commitments so far. just ahead of COP26, there was a formal communication from the Ministry of Environment anticipating the net zero pledge from 2060 to 2050. So it's a commitment that it still has to be formalized, but the communication was sent. The country, however, did not so far advance a clear long-term strategy. It submitted an NDC 2020. It still has to send a formal new one, and I'm going to talk about the new commitments and how do they relate to the 2015 NDC. So this is a large country, not as large, of course, as China and India, but it's also a large contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. It's either on the 7th or 6th position. It represents 2.19% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's a country that stands as 8th in the vulnerability index to climate change. But what I find, what is interesting here is that we have a profile of emissions that is significantly different from the world average. The electricity sector and the energy industry as a whole present a much lower participation in the global greenhouse, in the total greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a graph that presents or illustrates this. We have quite a challenge in terms of emissions coming from land use, as you might be aware. So comparing to world average, electricity and heat amount to 12.9% of emissions, while the world average represents 40%. And land use, in turn, is also 40% compared to a much lower amount for other countries. And so what do we have here? Let me see, have to adjust. The COP26 represented an opportunity to raise ambition for several countries. So the general understanding is that we are not on track to achieve the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And as I mentioned, Brazil increased its targets, anticipating the net zero pledge to 2050. And it signed a commitment to halt deforestation and reverse degraded forests by 2030, without clearly explaining or presenting a concrete action plan for that. And in the very final working hours, it adhered to the Paris Rule Book, so Article 6. But we still have a long way to go, and also to understand there is no clear legislation, there is no legislation approved in the country to cope with this agenda. And also I'm going to talk about, for example, climate policy instruments and how they have been presented so far. So there was this new announcement for the NDC, but there's a very important controversy. Several entities claimed that this increase in ambition from 43% to 50% reductions compared to the 2005 emissions baseline not exactly amounts to lower emissions. So the 2015 NDC would imply 1.2 million gigatons of CO2. And now when we compare this with the increase in the emissions, emission reduction targets, we see that according to two different baselines that are considered, the amount of emissions increased compared to the original NDC presented in 2015. Okay, this is very important. And here, when we consider, oh, sorry, I have to adjust to this, here, to the arrows. Okay, so this is a slide that shows climate policy initiatives around the world. South America has several countries that are either implementing or discussing the implementation of climate policy initiatives, mainly Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, but Brazil is still assessing or considering a climate policy instrument. What happened?
Sorry, color code here means red means?
Red means that there is a schedule to implement a climate policy instrument.
Yellow.
And the yellow is under consideration.
Okay.
And
green is?
The green is scheduled to implement it or implemented already. Okay. And so I'm going to talk about where does Brazil stand. So I already mentioned the NDC. And so far, the yellow that we have here, so under consideration, amounts to a project that was developed by the World Bank for several countries, and Brazil was selected for the first phase. It's the project Market Readiness to implement a climate policy instrument. We are talking about ETS. And so this was a task force that has worked for 4 years. And it's the only systematic approach that so far was developed. It had basically 3, I'm going to talk here. It has 3 building blocks. The first one includes sectoral studies to inform policy design and modeling, basically for an ETS. We are talking about an ETS system. And a second stage consisted of an integrated economic modeling to assess impacts of proposed policy packages. We are talking about options of ETS, considering different sectors to be included, from narrow to more general approaches. And then the third stage of the project consisted of communication and engagement, trying to assess even acceptability of the different policy options investigated in the project. So the project investigated 6 alternative scenarios, including carbon pricing mechanisms, compared to a command and control baseline scenario. The baseline scenario had a significant gap to be closed from the command and control reference policies to the NDC commitment. And all the 6 carbon pricing scenarios perform better relative to this command and control baseline, meaning they imply higher growth and employment. I am presenting here an article from a professor from FGV that has a joint appointment with MIT and working with IAM, investigated the impact of different ways or different ETS options. And his major result is that the most efficient way to reduce emissions is to have an ETS that includes several sectors, that is a general ETS, and it would allow for reallocating permits in the market more efficiently, meaning at lower cost. And The reason I'm contrasting these two is that the 6 policy scenarios investigated in the PMR do not exactly have a clear ranking in terms of the policy options. Basically, they reach the same outcome. And so Professor Gurgel presents a different approach. So the impact of a broader ETS would be better when we consider both the 2030 scenario as well as an extended one till 2015. So these are the impacts on the GDP compared to baseline. And we see the economy-wide cap and trade would imply a better performance than the COP and also the sectoral ones that were investigated in the PMR. Okay. And so what do we have? Sorry for this image here, but I did not manage to substitute. So what do we have so far in the energy sector? Only 2 instruments. First one was implemented in the liquid fuel sector. It's a mechanism similar to a carbon market that requires fossil fuel distributors to purchase biofuel decarbonization credits called CBIOs in proportion to their market share in the distribution of fossil fuels. And the governance is quite particular in the sense that federal oil and gas regulator is the entity in charge of certifying this credit. This is quite particular compared to other market implementations. Quite challenging indeed. So turning to the power sector here, this is a large country. I mentioned it developed its power system based on the large participation of hydropower plants, at first with reservoirs, and that benefits from certain complementarity between different renewable technologies like wind and biomass. And I'm going to discuss how this potential has been exploited and the challenges it has faced. So we have the wet season here that goes from December. So from December to March. So, and then for the hydro, see here, December through March. And in the dry season, we have high wind, and this allows for exploiting the complementarity between these 2 technologies. But there is a trend. So in the last 20 years, the increase in participation or the expansion of hydro participation has been impacted by social and environmental constraints. So the system has no longer expanded along the same basis, and this is important because when we are to accommodate an increasing participation of variable renewable energy sources, so it's important to have this combination with flexibility that at first was provided by this hydropower system with large reservoirs. Social and environmental constraints impair or prevent this expansion along the same lines. We have now a lower regularization capacity, and this is what is presented here. So before the last decades, we had multi-year storage, meaning we were able to accommodate fluctuations in variable renewable sources through this large participation of hydro. This is no longer true. And so it requires us to adapt the system from the technology perspective.
Just a curiosity, is this negative trend somehow also affected by deforestation and changes in climate over the long run?
Yes, Yes, and this is, we have, in this very year, experienced a severe hydro crisis. And see, at the same time, for example, that China was experiencing a crisis. So climate scientists claim that deforestation has impacted these hydro patterns, the water inflows. And so it's a challenge to manage that. And we have to adapt this not only from the technology perspective, but also from the perspective of the governance, market mechanisms to allow for this flexibility. So I mentioned that this is a large country that also benefited from a large grid. This is a system that expanded along the basis, along the lines of long-term contracting. Did not manage to develop markets similar to, in contrast to what happened, for example, in Europe and in US in the last 2 decades. And so we are talking about an emerging country that lacks institutional capacity. So we have to create a proper business environment to allow and to attract long-term investments. And the way to accommodate this uncertainty was to implement a architecture of long-term contracts. Long-term contracts for generation, meaning 15 to 30 years, long-term contracts for transmission, 30 years. And so at the same time, it's easier and it's more challenging. Several countries are facing several hurdles to expand transmission to accommodate this increasing participation of variable renewable sources. We have this sort of command and control, it's auctions. So the government basically auctions or allocates contracts, long-term contracts for investors in the power system through competitive bidding, procurement, or auctions. I'm going to show you the results of this market structure. So basically, we engaged in the restructuring trends that started in the 1990s. Sorry. So at first, a British company was commissioned to develop or to design the implementation of a reform. But JOSCO, I am referring to JOSCO because this is always easier. So JOSCO argues, and I agree, that poor design and incomplete implementation of this reform led to changes, significant changes in the way this market has evolved. In 2001, 2002, at the same time, California experienced a crisis in the electricity supply. We also had a severe drought, and this drought led to a political transition, and the political transition caused a significant change in the market structure. So the new architecture was based on long-term contracting, and as I was mentioning. And from 2016, there is a new wave of liberalization taking place, in part as a response to these changes in the underlying environment. Climate can also be considered one element in this equation. And since 2016, a new reform has been designed to incentivize contracting beyond the long-term environment, which was implemented from 2005. We claim that poor governance and political interference explains part of the shortcomings in the workings of this market. So I was telling, in 1996, we had a new institutional architecture implemented. It included the basics of restructuring reforms, meaning vertical separation of generation and the wired business. It has a specific, so it allows for integration between generation and transmission. And the way to cope with market power in transmission was the long-term contracting in transmission that I just mentioned. We also experienced significant privatization of distribution companies, creation of independent economic regulator, as well as a independent system operator and a market operator. The model for the system operator is not similar to the Italian experience. The Italian experience at first had a system operator that was independent, but then it was integrating assets. So it became the asset owner of transmission, Terna today. And this is different from what we have now. And then we allowed.
It was a full privatization, or there are still state-owned or partially state-owned enterprises in the market?
For distribution, around 40% of the distribution companies are still state-owned. Significant increase in private participation, but a few states remained in control of their distribution companies. And also it allowed for retail market contestability for large customers. So then I mentioned we experienced a crisis in 2001, 2002. At the same time, California experienced one, but the reason there was more closely related to market power, abuse of market power. Here, a drought combined with a poor design and implementation of a reform caused problems. The consequences is that we changed the approach to liberalization onward, shifting the focus from a design that pursued allocative and dynamic efficiency through markets, through a mechanism of long-term contracting for expanding the system. Okay. Then I was telling you that we had a change in the liberalization approach that led to this long-term contracting. So two contracting environments were established with competitive doors. Large consumers, commercial and industrial consumers are allowed to contract directly, but regulated consumers, meaning residential and small consumers, are supplied by distribution companies, so we did not experience unbundling between the wires and the energy business for small consumers. And then we experienced implementation of a regulatory framework, the basic regulatory compact, meaning high-powered incentives to distribution. But of course, we experienced a significant increase in cross subsidies, causing increases in electricity tariffs that impair or challenge affordability. I'm going to talk a bit about these two markets. So in consumers supplied by distribution companies in the regulated trading market are supplied through long-term PPAs, long-term contracts. These contracts are awarded through auctions. So the contracts extend to 20 to 35 years, depending on technology. Hydropower plants benefit from 30 to 35-year contracts, and other technologies, say variable renewable energy sources and also gas power plants, are entitled to 20-year contracts.
Professor, excuse me, 5 minutes.
Okay.
More or less. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to jump to the outcomes of this. What did we experience as a result of that? We managed to contract or to expand the system, including variable renewable energy sources, meaning wind, solar, and biomass. How? From 2005, these auctions allow to expand the system, including these technologies. Okay, here you can see biomass in the first wave. The green bars are wind power plants, second wave, and more recently, we have a third wave of solar technologies. But it comes at a cost. We identify efficiency issues here. Think about, these are the price trends. So here are the quantities, and here are the prices. The lines present the prices. And even though we have witnessed around the world significant cost reductions for these technologies, here you see that we have at first a declining trend for costs. The second moment we have an increasing price trend, and then a decreasing price trend. So what does it mean? This is an evidence of poor auction design, something that we explained in the paper, okay? And also, it managed to, despite the change in the underlying architecture, we managed to expand the system, preserving a significant participation of renewables, coming from 90 to 83% of renewables. This is significantly higher than the world trends. And more recently, we experienced also considerable participation of thermal power generation. So this is another evidence of efficiency problems in the auctions, not exactly efficiency problems, but this is an evidence of how the auctions are conditioned by certain parameters. So it's not exactly technology neutral. This is an evidence that certain parameters explain part of the results that we see. And more recently, the solar trend that I was presenting you benefits from net energy metering mechanism. This is a mechanism that implies significant cross subsidies. Why? Because small consumers that adopt net metering, meaning that install solar panels, do not cover network costs. And since the ones that are willing and able to invest in solar panels or rooftop solar panels are the ones with relatively higher income, we are shifting network costs to low income users. This is an element that pressures in the direction of a new liberalization trend, meaning it reinforces the need to unbundle the wire in the energy business. It's very interesting because at this very moment, California is going through a public consultation at the same time that we are to reform the net energy metering system. Also because of this regressive nature, several people, for example, from University of California at Berkeley have extensively investigated the regressive impacts of net metering. We have already identified important elements along the same lines. And one final element in this equation, when we assess the impact of this liberalization reforms into electricity prices, we have here the blue line is the general price index, and this is the price for electricity. So apart from this movement here, this period here from 2012 to 2015, in which we experienced a political interference, in general, electricity prices have increased significantly above inflation, despite the high participation of renewables. So these reforms did not exactly translate into lower price for electricity users. So this is the final element. I'm thinking I'm coming to the end. So the new elements in the equation is that we have experienced increasing climate variability that threatens security of supply in a context of diminishing regularization capacity of this originally hydro-based system. There is a new trend for decentralization, increasing participation of variable renewable energy sources in the generation mix that threatens sustainability and affordability in the model in which we have predominantly regulated customers. So we are experiencing utilities that spiral, similar to several other countries. And there is this new wave of liberalization combined with decentralization that challenges bankability under the existing framework. And this climate variability also reinforces the critical elements of the water, energy, food nexus. This is a project of work that we developed for IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, in which we assess how the frontiers between the water and the energy sector have been fading, and what are the impacts for the architecture of these industries and the need to to deal with them in a joint way. For example, when we consider trade, international trade, agricultural products amount for 55% of global exports in the region. So it's not enough to keep on adopting an approach in which electricity sector has a favored attitude. So this is the final one, a favored attitude from the first perspective of the power sector workings. And so what are the lessons learned? So in the paper, we present elements that illustrate the experience of a predominantly renewable power system that is in need to detach itself from a highly centralized contracting environment to allow reaching SDG 7 goals, meaning to ensure clean, secure, and affordable energy for all. We claim the current market design is not robust enough to address the changes in the underlying conditions at inception, and it's being further challenged by this increasing climate variability. There are considerable gains to be achieved from decentralization and digitization, pillars of the energy transition, but for that, regulations must adapt to changing market conditions, to disruptions, and to promote resilience, so adaptation in a timely manner. This is it. So just, okay, so we claim that we are, again, at a crossroad, okay? So there is a fork on the road. Are we really going to reform the sector to avoid, to adapt to the underlying environment, or favoring a sort of lip service approach in which we keep on following this long-term contracting framework that in the end of the day is being challenged by climate variability? This is it.
Thank you.
Ask you one question.
Oh, yeah.
The fact that the prices have not, I mean, they have increased more than consumer price index. I'm not sure because whether, according to your view of the market, is due to privatization not going well enough, or the introduction of renewables that are more expensive. So I'm just wondering, do you see any role in fact, I mean, is there any way to check whether had you let more power, more role of the public sector had any effect on the price trend? So you said that 40% of the operators are still public, 60 are not. So do you see any clear difference in performance between public and publicly provided energy? And also, yeah, I mean, what are I'm not sure what is the reason, the mechanism you see for the fact that the energy has gone up more than the consumer price index.
Yes, you were asking me what, in our view, explains the significantly higher price increase compared to general price index.
Can you go back to that particular graph or slides, which in my opinion was probably this one?
Yes. So if you decompose electricity prices, so this is important because this is from the perspective of price indexes, but we also assessed from the perspective of prices as determined by the regulator. So roughly 40% of the prices, 40% of the costs related to energy. Okay, and so it's interesting because even though we have experienced significant cost reductions for these technologies around the world, and also apart from this period here, okay, apart from this period here, we had experienced price reductions. So prices have increased significantly higher above the inflation. This is a large country, but it's a closed economy. We still have market power. Okay, so part of these cost reductions have been absorbed by generation investors. So this is a matter of market design. Yeah, and the other one is that this long-term framework includes contracts, or is based on contracts that are indexed to inflation in a country that is plagued by high inflation. We have experienced hyperinflation in the past. So this is always a trap. What happens is, for example, think about here. These are the lines here illustrate current prices for auctions, so for investments that took place based on auctions that happened in 2005. So this is the price for this energy as perceived today, so adjusted by inflation. We are talking about prices that for contracts as long as 15 to 20 years, guarantee around $60, $80, $100. So this is significantly high. So I claim that these price trends, or that you see here, are firstly explained by market design. And there is another element here there is universal access to electricity. 99.8% of the population is connected to the grid. The government, not only federal, but also state governments, understood that electricity prices were good vehicles for taxation. And so these prices here are explained by, firstly, high generation prices, distributive policies, and also taxation. So electricity has been a very good vehicle to raise taxes, to raise taxation.
Well, but you also have that I mean, do you have any figure of, for instance, the profit of privatized firms? So, I mean, this might also be, as you said, I mean, maybe the market was not so much competitive. And so basically part of this increase in prices is due to the fact that the market is not really a market.
Yes, the market is not really a market.
Right.
But this is what we claim, the market is not really a market. This was the choice that was made back then. So to ensure returns for investments at the cost of very long-term contracting. So it's not exactly a market. We do not have a market. There is not competition in the market. There is competition for the market. Investors bid for PPAs, 15, 20, or hydro, in the case of hydro, 30-year contracts. So there is no competition, only for entry into the market, but then you are insured high returns for that.
Yeah, I mean, stop talking.
There is what?
And then I stopped talking because otherwise.
No, please. If I did not make myself clear.
No, sure. I'm just wondering, I mean, also in terms of support for change towards more renewable energy, isn't it somehow this experience trends in the increasing prices jeopardizing the public support for reducing? I mean, I'm worried about what is the public support for more reforms towards more renewables, or I mean, is there no risk that the larger use of renewable energies is perceived as possible reason for the increase in prices, whereas one of the main problem is the fact that the market is not really a market.
I dare say it is. It is. People very rarely understand that this is a matter of market design. It's a problem. And there is this here. See, what is this here? I was telling you there is a high participation of renewables in these auctions, but when we see, for example, the last 4 years, there is significant contracting of gas generation. Why is that? Because not only people perceive high prices, but they understand, or there is an increasing perception, and also in the government official speech, that this high participation of renewable in the context of increasing climate variability does not ensure security and reliability of supply. I dare say that this is one of the major threats, okay? And this is how we have worked, or this is the main question for us, is how important it is to disentangle market design problems and the need to adapt the underlying market framework, okay, to this context of increasing climate variability. Why? Because it's interesting. We are talking about a system of 180 gigawatts of installed capacity. 100 of that is hydropower generation. But the main main storage technology in the world, more than 95 storage capacity is pumped hydro storage. Yes. And despite having this very high participation of hydro, there is no pumped hydro storage there. I don't know if you're familiar with pumped hydro storage. Is that the electricity is generated, and then in low price periods, it's pumped upwards. Here we did not have a market. We did not have price differences. We did not have incentives to adapt its technology to develop storage capacity. Storage capacity is key to accommodate higher participation of variable renewable energy technologies. So this is, in the end of the day, it is a matter of market design. There are ways to adapt without moving beyond high participation of renewables, but market design has to adapt. And in the foreseeable future, we do not identify changes along the lines we understand important.
So you're not very optimistic.
I'm sorry, I'm not. What they decided to do instead of, so very broad lines, liberalization trends in the 90s, markets, electricity markets, wholesale energy markets. In 2002, when we had the crisis, we went this way. We moved beyond markets, wholesale energy markets, okay? And now what is happening? Instead of designing a market or pursuing efficiency through markets, something that is challenging, now the government is about to implement capacity markets. And this is a very big issue in Europe, for example. Yes. So the European Commission has challenged the need to make extensive use of capacity markets. But here you are combining the capacity market with an energy market. We did not manage to implement an energy market, and we are moving in the direction of capacity contracting. So we are simply expanding this long-term contracting framework at a cost, efficiency, and higher electricity prices. This is our assessment.
Okay, thank you. So we still have few minutes. If you want just to hear the other questions, maybe our audience have, then we can wrap up and finalize everything. If there are other questions.
I have a couple of short questions. The first one, that at the end of the day, from your presentation, it seems that one of the biggest issues for Brazil is the management of the hydropower generation sector. And I mean, for instance, when I was looking at the graph with the price trend, there was a sort of pattern in which water price index increases a lot, along with the price of regulated energy, I guess. And this is, I guess, due to the long-term contract that you were mentioning. I mean, it seems that the regulated part of energy is completely mirroring the pattern, the future pattern of water price. And given that the generation of electricity from hydro is is closely related with climate change and climate policies, I was I was wondering how much or if there is a discussion of how to improve the electricity market via climate policy or reforestation, stuff like that. Yeah, and the second question is really short. When you hear discussion about energy transition, you always think about renewable energy, but it seems that for Brazil, this kind of transition is already there. So maybe your energy transition has to do with diversification toward, for instance, nuclear. And I was wondering if there is a discussion about introducing nuclear power in Brazil.
Your questions are not short in answer. Okay, so first one. There is another way to interpret this graph, and I think you touched upon it. This is the general price index. This purple line is prices for goods and services that are not regulated. And these are the components of general price index related to regulated or network industries. And you pointed that there are some patterns, co-movements here. So what is the difference? Green is electricity, okay, water is yellow, okay, and then we have gas is red, okay, and they differ significantly in terms of their access, in terms of access. Electricity is the only one for which we have universal access. So for gas, for example, this is available to 5% of the population. Okay, and water and sanitation is available to 80% of the population. It depends, 90% for water and 50% for sanitation. So we are comparing services that differ in terms of scope or the extent in which they are available to customers. But in general, what we are talking about is that regulated prices are increasing above inflation. So there are some elements here that are connected to regulation that are taking us in the direction of price increases. This is one of the elements. The second question is, I think you're right. We are talking about an energy transition, and it's interesting because in terms of the desired participation of renewables, we are ahead in the game, yes. And this illustrates, as I mentioned, the challenges. How are we going to accommodate? I presented you, for example, the gray line illustrates a policy option for gas. Gas is available as well. We did not manage to reform this industry, so it is still dominated by a national oil company. So we're talking about market power, yes, that impairs, for example, the participation or competitive the development of a competitive market. This is the first. The second question you asked is, can nuclear play a higher role? As of now, nuclear amounts to less than 2% of this installed capacity. What we have seen around the world is that nuclear is costly. In general, for countries in which countries that do not benefit from high institutional capacity, good business environment, requires participation of public capital, yes. And the challenge would be to understand the role that could be played by new technologies, new nuclear technologies. Can they be available at a lower cost in terms of the discontinuities? So it's not a matter of the general, it's a matter of the general investment, the total investment required. So As of now, the Ministry of Energy in this country is from the, it's how do you say, from the Navy. And the minister is a specialist in nuclear technology. He has advanced plans to expand significantly the participation of nuclear technologies. But in the end of the day, we are going to have presidential elections next year. And nuclear is a very long-term commitment. So are we going to move beyond the plans? Will we be able to pursue a long-term agenda once he's out of his position? The answer is still out. But, you know, I'm not a nuclear person. I do not know enough. I dare say I used to have a more skeptical approach towards it and towards the role it could play in an environment like this. I used to be more skeptical than I am today. Today, I'm an observer.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions.
I didn't hear any questions from you.
No, I was just, it is not just it is not a question, it is just a comment of very, very general nature. And the comment is that if we really think to win the climate change battle with convincing consumers and citizens in general that they have to pay more with liberalized systems and with renewables than otherwise, probably the battle is lost. I mean, I never remember a situation in which a big transition has been won with inefficient solution, more costly solutions than the alternative. We have seen this a lot in Italy, I think. People not yet fully realize how much in their electricity bill is because solar energy is so heavily subsidized by the consumers. So now that the prices of electricity and energy in general are up, I wonder whether people will be happy with such arrangements. I think this is the general weak point of all this discourse about the energy transition. So my personal feeling is that either we really invent a technological breakthrough, we really have new technologies that are less costly than the emission generating technology, or the battle is lost. Probably the battle of the 1.5% degrees is already lost. But there may be even worse than the 1.5. So my general comment is that if a consumer looks at that graph and says, oh, okay, what is there for me? Probably that would increase the appeal of populists. Say, let's burn what we have. Let's burn carbon in China and the Amazons in Brazil, and that's it. We need to pay so much.
Maybe the solution could be in the digital advancement that really can make it back to leapfrog in the market system. For example, now if you're investing in solar and thermal, in solar and wind, how then is the grid, the smart grid built in order to share this electricity even in a remote area outside the main cities? So maybe these reforms should better also incorporate the idea that without this digitalization of the markets, we won't be able to convince consumers that it's worth it to pay more because it's more safe for the environment.
And if I can add on this, well, digitalization, I mean, it is not an easy story, because the issue here in general is the issue of storage. The technologies we have for storage are still primitive. I mean, the kind of batteries we have are still primitive, and we are even, as you mentioned, we are even unable to really use the old but reliable water reservoir approach, which is, after all, very efficient. We are unable to really use that, and we are thinking to having millions of batteries around to store energy in the system to accommodate for the variability of the renewables, of some kind of renewables. So my feeling is that we would need to discuss much more about science and technology and less about market. Because after all, markets can go up to a certain point. It is not optimizing the use of horses that we have moved to another history in transport, right? Or optimizing on sailing ships was not the way to solve the problem of maritime transport. There were a lot, there were hundreds, there were libraries about how to optimizing sailing before the world decided that that technology was dead. So
I fully agree with you, and this relates to a part of your question that I did not answer. Firstly, this illustrates the need to have a more comprehensive approach that takes climate into the energy equation, something that we are not doing properly. And we did not board the market station in the 1990s, or at least we onboarded in 2001, 2002. And the answer is not in the same train. And this is clear. For example, I take part in several of the discussions in the Harvard Electricity Policy Group, and Bill Hogan, one advocate of markets, is sort of asking himself not exactly whether markets can play a more important role, but how the reality makes it challenging to have markets taking us in the direction we would have to go. This is the first. You claim the answer is in the technology. Yes, I agree. And the answer is a very important part of this answer is in the technologies that are not yet in the market. But the question is, how are we going to allow for these technologies to come to the market? And not only to come to the market, but also to come to the market in economies beyond Europe and US, or say China. Are countries like this supposed to remain laggards? Or could we also take part into this search for some of the technologies that we are going to need to develop, to deploy, to face the challenge that is huge? This is a very important element. And I have written 2 articles very recently. One is in the technology, the need. So we are far from the 1.5. The part of the answer, very important part of the answer is technology. How can you allow for technologies to be developed in countries beyond this one? So what are the policies that we would have to implement, and even beyond hydrogen, because hydrogen may be an answer, part of the answer, but it's not enough. So what is the role of electrification of mobility? How can we, one challenge that is posed for this environment here is, if we are facing challenges to ensure reliability and security of supply for this sector, how are we going to electrify another sector like transport? This is very important. And the third element is the need to ensure supply of the resources along the value chain. So we are talking about critical minerals. Yes. And so several pieces of this puzzle have to be addressed, have to be taken into account. And the question is, what is the role for emerging markets beyond China and India to play in this race? This is a very important question.
I have an answer for the first question. My answer would be that it is a rather a visionary answer. I think that we would need something as a joint effort worldwide, but certainly in Europe, to promote these new technologies and to donate them to the world. So what I have in mind is that it would be unrealistic to think that individual countries, perhaps only the United States or China, could do that, but they are not going to do that for a number of reasons. It is unrealistic to think that any country can develop a scientific and technological strategy for energy transition. So what we would need is something as a CERN or an international energy agency based on science to invent the technologies of the future and donate them to the world. So creating some kind of public good in terms of knowledge of the transition.
Can I just say what have we learned from the handling of COVID-19 pandemics?
Mm-hmm. It's exactly the same point. I mean, it's exactly the same point. We cannot expect for the future of next pandemics that a country by country approach and the market approach when there are global public goods is the right approach.
Yeah, but vaccines were not made available beyond developed economies.
Exactly for that. I mean, a Moderna vaccine or a Pfizer vaccine has a marginal cost around $1, 1.5, and they are sold at $25. And this is simply based on the fact that the patenting system rewards the end of the chain. and doesn't reward all the accumulated knowledge year after year. Now, it is a market, in these very days, the National Institutes of Health has announced that probably they will go against Moderna in the courts, because Moderna has not even cited the fact that there were patents owned by the NIH, so the public sector, in their own patents. But this is an extreme case. So we have a global public good, which is health. We have a global public good, which is adaptation to climate change.
Yeah.
And the idea that we can manage this with the consumers paying higher prices and the firms changing their portfolio, just responding to incentives. I think it is a sure recipe for a disaster. Let me give another example. The example of the Tesla cars. Okay. So currently, Tesla, the value of the Tesla in the market is a multiple of the sum of all the other automotive companies. This is just because investors think that that is going to be the technology that is going to win. If they win in that sense, it would be a disaster, because we'll move from fossil fuels to 100 million cars needing a battery with lithium, which is an exhaustible resource. So we are preparing a disaster in which some countries have lithium and some other minerals which are needed for those batteries. So this is an example of the wrong strategy, I think. So I don't know. This is not very. It's just an impression. Not,
No, I fully agree with you, but this is why firstly we need. So the answer is in technology. So how can we foster development of these technologies, not only in the usual suspects?
we would need something as the Manhattan Project for the atomic bomb. The objective of the Manhattan Project, when it was proposed, was to win the war against Hitler, right? So they put together 130,000 scientists and technicians, and they invented the bomb, unfortunately. And they used it on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the same time, they invented the nuclear technology for civil use. So that was a government action for an emergency. And we are in an emergency, and we need a government action similar to the Manhattan Project for this kind of things. I can give you a number of examples of technological breakthrough which are needed. For instance, in transmission. I mean, we are trying to optimize a system in which a lot of energy is just dissipated because our cables are not efficient. And there is research, for instance, at CERN about superconductivity of cables, which would decrease a lot so it is as in water, having a market that optimizes in a system in which you have leakages. But if you have leakages, you cannot optimize much. You have first of all to repair your leakages, and so on. There are a number of examples. But this is just a topic. It is not very.
So you claim that benefits that could accrue from markets are of second order compared to the gains that could be achieved by new technology.
Exactly. I mean, because I am an amateur sailor, would you really think that we can solve the problem of? I mean, you can try and convince the world that instead of having tankers and these ships which burn a lot, you can go back to sailing, optimized sailing. But this is crazy. This is not good. It would be nice to have this ships with five masters.
But technology innovation does not happen in a vacuum. You
Yes,
need good
yes.
policies to foster it.
Yes.
So this is one of the key elements. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
By the odds for Bolsonaro to be elected.
I don't know,